Tonight, China refuses to apologise and wants the Albanese government to pull its head in after China attacked our Navy. And so far, the Prime Minister's doing just that. Our shame grows. Plus, my boss, Lachlan Murdoch, goes to Ukraine to meet its president and sends a message to the political right. I'll tell you what's really behind that trip. Also tonight, why driving an electric car from Sydney to Melbourne and back again costs more and takes longer. And that is bad news for Labor. Plus, meet Argentina's new president. Is he mad or the voice of freedom?
¡Zurdos, hijos de puta, tiemblen! ¡La libertad avanza! ¡Viva la libertad, carajo!
But first, every week there's more evidence that the Albanese government's other big crusade is collapsing. Now, the first, of course, was the voice, being defeated. Now its other crusade, the green energy revolution, is turning into an even bigger disaster. I'll give you some amazing statistics today, but let me start with some context. An anecdote. Belinda Cleary, she's a Daily Mail reporter. She decided to drive her electric car, an $87,000 Hyundai Ioniq, from Sydney to Melbourne and back again, which turned out to be a mistake. Driving the Melbourne leg, for instance, meant stopping 3 times to recharge for as long as 35 minutes a pop. That recharging, the last one just a partial one to save time, cost $86 in total. And the return trip to Sydney was even worse, $120, and again, all those stops. And that bill, by the way, is more than she reckons refuelling would have cost her in petrol. In conclusion, driving that route in an electric car took longer, cost more, and involved a lot more anxiety, wondering where the next recharging station was. And I'll talk about that in a minute with a motoring expert. But it's no wonder then that sales of electric cars are not going as fast as the Albanese government expected. And pop, there goes yet another Albanese green scheme. See, the government thought it could make 89% of Australians who were buying new cars in 2030, 89% of them make them buy an electric one. Now, as I said at the time, this was a joke. I mean, you'd have to be a complete moron to think this would happen. And you've got to ask, does this government of dreamers have any idea about the realities as it faffs around now with schemes to make you buy these expensive electric cars, like it's planned to ban cheaper petrol ones that we prefer? But now the Federal Transport Department has warned the government quite directly that its dreams are dust. The department says electric cars won't make up 89% of new car sales in 7 years, won't even make a third of that. Try 27%, if that. So another failure. Another scheme to cut our emissions, looking pretty cactus. So how is the government's big green dream now working out? Well, we already know the government's way behind in rolling out wind farms. Costs have soared as well. The 10,000 kilometres of transmission wires it needs to join them all up, also way behind, also way over budget. The Snowy project, it needs to store renewable energy for when we need it, again, way behind, 10 times over budget. So now, everywhere you look, the government's targets for 2030, they're a mess, despite the spending of billions of borrowed dollars. I mean, you just count the targets. It's 43% emissions reduction target, in huge strife. It's 82% renewable energy target. Industry leaders agree it's hopeless. It's 89% electric vehicle target. It's just been told it's impossible. It's promised $275 cut in power bills. Well, as you know, that's a joke. So fail, 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 and fail. Now, this is important. And not just because we're paying much more for our energy and for nothing. It's also important because this government is still struggling to get back to the basics, the cost of living, which this mucking around with green produce is just making worse. Energy bills, anyone? The government keeps getting distracted by these idiotic crusades, the voice and global warming, and distracted too by the Prime Minister's constant travelling, because there's no focus at all. Well, today, the Treasurer, Jim Chalmers, he did give a speech to tell us that, by golly, he at least is delivering on this cost of living stuff this economy, although he was short of examples and very long on buts.
Among all of the countries that we compare ourselves with, we are in a better position than most, if not all, of those countries. Obviously, growth is slowing in our economy. Confidence at a consumer level is relatively low, but we have a very resilient labour market. Business investment has been really quite remarkably strong, and we have other advantages as well, particularly when it comes to what we sell the world, the prices that we're getting, and a range of other benefits as well.
All right, rosy picture, as rosy as you could make it, but in fact the government is setting very unfortunate records. And the headlines tell the story, like record immigration intake, which is producing record house prices, making buying a home a luxury just for the rich. Like record inflation rate, well, the highest of advanced economies. Like record productivity, low productivity growth in 60 years. And another record amongst the highest electricity prices in the world. I mean, what is this government doing and where is it going? People are screaming for relief and you're seeing this instead. When will it stop dreaming and start producing? And the thing is here, I mean, I think Jim Chalmers is suddenly thinking, Albanese on the skids, there's my chance here. Jim Chalmers, the Treasurer, actually seems to think his record of achievement, or whatever you want to call it, is one that could make him your next Prime Minister. I mean, you've got, this Prime Minister playing the tourist, little interest in economics. And so Chalmers is out there fluffing his feathers and clearing the decks. I mean, did you see that puff piece last weekend on him in the Sydney Morning Herald, where he announced he's gone on the wagon, which, of course, as you know, is what Labor MPs do when they want to be Prime Minister. Bob Hawke, for instance, Albanese also cut off whatever it was that was making him fat and all that kind of stuff. Now, in Chalmers' case, this, look, I've gone off the booze, is also a built-in excuse. It's a protection wall. Take this confession from this article, Chalmers speaking. Until 3 years ago, he said, my main way of winding down was to drink beers and wines at night on the couch. And it wasn't one or two. And the reporter then responds, well, there's also talk of you cutting a bit loose socially around Parliament House. To that, Chalmers responds, because I was drinking too much. So you've got to ask what that actually means, that Chalmers was cutting a bit loose socially when he was working in Parliament House. But don't you worry about that, because whatever it was, the booze made Chalmers do it and is off the booze now, so that's all you need to know, which is very convenient for him. But perhaps the Treasurer should talk less about his drinking and the Prime Minister do less of that dreaming, because I think it is high time that they both just got down to the hard and boring work of making life less hard for everyone else. It's a rule. The government that tries to plan the economy almost always stuffs it up. And later on in the show, I'll introduce you to Argentina's new president, because boy, does this character believe that. But Labor, not so much. Our Prime Minister has a plan, of course, as I mentioned, to get us to buy electric cars, nearly 90% electric cars, not petrol, just 7 years from now. Global warming and all that. Not that these cars will make any difference, because as you know, they run on electricity. 2/3 of that comes from fossil fuels. And they take more energy to make. But as I said, government's own transport department says, well, even then, you're not going to get your 89% of new car sales electric by 2030, try maybe 27%. So why does the government look like making only 1/3 of its target for electric car sales? Joining me is Paul Gover, a motoring writer genius who was what were you, Paul? You got in the Hall of Fame of supercars as well, weren't you? I'm so jealous of that as well. But Paul, how come this target is being undershot so badly?
Well, it's a whole raft of reasons, Andrew. Basically, not enough cars, not enough interest, not enough infrastructure. The cars are too expensive. They don't do what most Australians want their cars to do. And that's without talking about pickups that are the big rage these days. But basically, they're too expensive and they can't do what people want to do. You can't really travel long distances in an electric vehicle these days.
But Paul, I know that you're smart on all this stuff. You were saying this years ago. I'm not smart. I was saying this on cars, and I was saying this some time ago. Tell me how the government, though, which has got all the money to pay all these experts, got it so wrong.
Well, I think one of the things is that if you ask people the right question, you'll get the right answer. So the first question is, are you considering buying an electric car for your next car? Huge percentage of people around the world, over 80% in some countries, say, yes, I'm considering one. And then they stop, because the next question is, will you actually buy one? And the answer to that is, most likely these days, no, not yet. Even in Europe, where the pickup of electric cars is much higher and they're further down the road, right now, research out of Europe is saying people are going to wait 3 to 5 years until better electric cars at better prices come along.
I mean, that's I've been attracted by the tales of very rapid acceleration. I like that safety features and all that. But again, price and not enough convenience when you're driving the long distances. Now, I mentioned that Daily Mail reporter driving from Sydney to Melbourne and back again, 3 stops each way, nearly an hour and a half of just standing around. I mean, is that something that's going to be fixed anytime soon?
No, not anytime soon. The only company that's got it right is Tesla, which is one of the reasons why they sell so well in Australia, around the world. They set up the infrastructure with their high-speed charging system. And if you've got a Tesla, you can do that sort of trip not too badly. But I also have a friend who bought another brand of car. He wanted to go from Canberra to Melbourne. Took him 3 days, Andrew. Because the other thing is the infrastructure we do have, because 3 days. Because the infrastructure we do have, the charging places we do have, there are a lot of them that don't work and there are a lot of them that are very slow. The other thing, Andrew, if you happen to turn up, it's not like a petrol pump where if you pull up behind somebody else, they'll be gone in 5-10 minutes. Well, if you turn up behind somebody at an electric charging place, you could be there waiting for an hour. And if you're the second person there, that's 2 hours. And I know this because I've been to charging places, I've talked to the people who own electric cars, and I've sat in the queue myself for over an hour a couple of times to charge up an electric car. I was road testing.
Oh, just one thing about that story that knocked me back, and you might be able to tell us what the facts are. That story was that it cost more to recharge her electric car on this, back and forth, Sydney, Melbourne, Sydney, than it would to fill a petrol car. Can that be right?
It could be right. I actually did something the other day where I charged the vehicle because I was worried I wasn't going to get back to where I needed to drop the car off. It cost me $30 to charge it up to get the range that I needed. Now, because that was on the highway, that's when electric cars are at their worst for fuel economy, when a combustion car's at its best. A combustion car is running at low RPM, constant speed, so you're not accelerating and decelerating, all of that sort of stuff. Whereas in an electric car, you've got a constant battery drain and you've got the you'll have the air conditioning on and stuff. So its maximum drain is at a highway constant speed. Because one of the good things about electric cars is when you drive them around the city and suburbs, when you lift off, that's how they get what's called regenerative braking. Don't need to know what that is, Andrew. But basically, it charges up the battery. So when you're going stop, start, you get the battery topped up again. If you're driving down the highway from Sydney to Melbourne or Melbourne to Sydney, it's a constant drain and there's nothing you can do about it.
Mate, I do know about regenerative braking, probably because you told me. But anyway, should the government give up then this dream of 89% electric car sales by 2030 and push even, or should it push even harder to make us go electric by banning gassier petrol cars like it says it wants to do?
Well, they're not going to ban that. They're not going to ban combustion engines. Nowhere in the world is doing that. There are countries that have tried to tax us excessively to get people out of the combustion cars. But interestingly, the UK, which had moved their target for all electric sales, they moved it forward from 2035, which is the rest of Europe, to 2020, 2030, they've actually gone back 5 years. So it's not working in the UK either. You can't tax people. It's like you can't spend your way to a profit. You can't tax people to make them give up stuff they actually need. And we see that every day. What they need to do is have better incentives, a clearer plan, because just I can pick a number out of my back pocket here. I could say that by 2030, we'll have 47% electric cars. But the other thing is technology is changing all the time. One of the good things that's coming along is what's called a plug-in hybrid. So it's a hybrid where you can plug it into the wall socket and run it fully electric for up to, most of them these days are about 60 kilometres. You can get that sort of range out of them. Ford are bringing a Ranger, their pickup, with a plug-in hybrid. But how much is it going to cost you, Andrew? It's going to cost you $80,000 for one of those.
This is the thing. This is the thing, the practicalities. Paul Gover, always great to talk to you. Thank you so much. This, what I'm about to tell you, is more than just that, hey, my boss went to Ukraine, isn't he cool, PR. This is significant, and I will want to tell you just why. Lachlan Murdoch has just visited Ukraine to meet its president, Volodymyr Zelensky, and his team with him, to learn something about the war there and show support, of course, for a nation under Russian attack. Now, until last week, Rupert Murdoch has been the big boss of News Corp, which includes Sky News, Australia's biggest newspapers, papers in Britain, the US, and of course, Fox News, beloved of many on the right. But now, of course, the boss is Lachlan, his eldest son. Now, Lachlan is probably an even bigger introvert than me, and quite modest as well. He almost never grants interviews. I don't know whether you noticed. He stays in the background. But becoming boss comes with responsibilities, including political responsibilities. And contrary to popular belief, the Murdochs do not tell their journalists what to say, which is why, for instance, you get more different opinions here on Sky News than on the ABC, as you saw during the Voice debate. But they can make a statement. Like 2 weeks ago, Lachlan Murdoch making a speech in Australia denouncing this shocking Jew hatred. Another statement now, this trip to Ukraine. Lachlan Murdoch believes in freedom, and not just freedom of opinion. And believe me, it's not spin, he means it. And there's a political context to this. In the US, the far right of the Republican Party includes isolationists, big notice and conspiracy theorists, attention seekers who want the US to stop sending Ukraine military aid. And Donald Trump is, of course, hinting that he could be one of them. If he becomes president in a year's time, Ukraine could be in trouble. What's more, far-right journalists, conspiracy theorists, even apologists for Russian war criminal Vladimir Putin, they are promoting anti-Ukraine sentiment, and not just in America. Now, of course, they include Tucker Carlson, the now fired Fox News host, whose anti-Ukraine propaganda was so poisonous that Russian television stations kept playing clips of him. I must say, Tucker Carlson was not sacked because of that, although I think he should have been. But anyway, that's just me. Lachlan Murdoch now, though, has made his own statement. He has already donated $1 million to Red Cross work in Ukraine, and on the weekend he went to Kiev with Fox News reporter Benjamin Hall, who had a leg and both feet blown off reporting from Ukraine. 2 colleagues were killed. Zelensky took this opportunity to award Hall Ukraine's Order of Merit for risking his life to tell the world the truth about Ukraine's peril.
Days, weeks and months of a difficult period for Ukraine, but very strong period. Thank you for your big support.
But I think we just hope that there's a real purpose for journalism. So people around the world know what's happening here. And that may come with some injuries and some danger, but that's why we do it, because we know how important it is. So, thank you very much. Appreciate it. Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Now, Lachlan Murdoch and Benjamin Hall and the rest of the team there with them, they had briefings from the Ukrainian government, met religious leaders, laid flowers for the dead. Freedom needs champions, and I am proud that Lachlan Murdoch is one. Joining me from Canberra is Ukrainian Ambassador Vasyl Miroshnichenko. Ambassador Miroshnichenko, thank you so much indeed for your time. You've seen support for Ukraine falling in America in particular, with some politicians of the Republican right wing, among some far-right journalists, conspiracy theorists like Tucker Carlson, who was actually sacked from Fox News. Given all that, what do you see as the significance of Lachlan Murdoch visiting your president?
I think it was a very important visit for Lachlan Murdoch to Ukraine, to see the president of Ukraine have that meeting. The News Corporation and all the companies globally play a very important role in covering the Russian aggression in Ukraine. It's important to keep it in the focus, to keep Ukraine in focus, to keep what is writing and reporting about what is happening in Ukraine, because it has a global impact. It has a global impact on the international security and in every part of the world.
But the thing is, too, it comes in a political context where there are people on the far right, conspiracy theorists also on the Republican far right, that are saying, well, look, Ukraine's war is not ours, we've got to stop funding. For instance, how worried are you that if Donald Trump becomes president in a year's time, the US funding for Ukraine will be cut off?
He was quite silent on that, and maybe that's one of the concerns that we all have in terms of predictability, what can happen if he is elected as the president. However, I would like to also remind one fact. It was actually when he was the president of the United States, Ukraine got javelins. It was under his administration that Ukraine got these anti-tank missiles, which were so efficient in the initial days of the Russian invasion last year.
Well, let's not give up hope just yet then of him. Meanwhile, of course, there's another war that's taking attention away from your war, that's Israel's with the Hamas terrorist group. How is that affecting your war against the Russian invaders in terms of the arms you're going to get, the necessary support you want?
We definitely see how Russians are benefiting from what is happening currently in the Middle East, as media attention is now currently on Israel and Palestine, whatever is happening there. And it's just something inevitable in a way that media works. Also, of course, the attention of the decision makers in North America as well as in Europe is now also has to be divided to cover two big conflicts out there. So it's not helping us much. And plus, we are getting into the winter and getting ready for those cold days. And Russians are now intensifying their attacks on our critical infrastructure and our power generation and electricity distribution. And of course, when Ukraine is no longer in the news, it looks like maybe the problem does not exist. And maybe it's already gone and the war is over. But it's not. I mean, it's really at high intensity. And we need support now as never before. Therefore, we hope that this could be sustained, because only with that sustained international military and humanitarian support that we can continue defending democracy. We have to always remember what is on the line, and authoritarianism cannot triumph over democracy and war over peace and might over what is right at this time. Therefore, it's important to maintain that support. We are out there fighting for all of you, fighting for democracy, for human rights, and whatever is important here in the free world.
Meanwhile, about the progress of the war, I mean, you mentioned that you're preparing for winter. Parts of the battlefield are really now, you know, the Ukrainian mud that sinks tanks or at least bogs them. That's the end of your summer offensive, your autumn offensive. The head of Ukraine's defence force has been brilliant in resisting the Russian invasion, but has just published, as you know, a surprising 9-page assessment of the war so far. And he said essentially the war now is at a stalemate. That's dangerous for Ukraine, the smaller nation, unless it can get some technological breakthroughs. How do you read this document?
Russia is demonstrating that they are ready for a protracted war, relying on its own resources, on the war fatigue, and also on its nuclear blackmailing. Indeed, we do need a technological breakthrough to have an edge and to be able to move forward. Just to remind you, the last counteroffensive, which started in early June, we didn't have the air superiority, we didn't have the fighter jets. Also, we still lack many of the long-range capabilities. But in addition to that, we do need some modern mine-breaching technology as well as electronic warfare technology. And our Chief of General Staff has really elaborated quite a compelling article where he's describing that. And I think it was a strong message to our supporters, to those countries who are out there, to work together with us to make sure that we can gain that technological advantage in order to be able to move forward. Being on an offensive is much more difficult because you have to keep in mind that we have kilometers of the minefields, and the minute you get there, Russian artillery comes, and it's extremely costly to be able to move through those kilometers of landmines out there, especially without proper technology to clear that, but also without the air cover which you need to be able to even attempt it.
You're not getting downhearted about your prospects?
If you ask Ukrainians, we still feel very united and resilient in what we are. We just don't have any other choice, because if Russia stops fighting, it's the end of the war. If we stop fighting, it's the end of Ukraine. So for us, it's an existential war, and we don't have any other option but not to give up. As President Zelensky has rightly said, many commentators or many people who are watching this war, they are expecting some sort of movie where action will be changing very fast and things will be happening. But in real life, it's a bit different. And this is when it slows down. We still need that support to be able to go on.
Ambassador Vasyl Miroshnichenko, thank you so much indeed for your time.
Thanks for having me, Andrew.
After the break, China tells Anthony Albanese to shut up about its attack that injured our Navy divers. Did it really have to tell him? The panel on this growing scandal after this. Turns out China has zero shame in hurting our Navy divers. Instead, it's issued a statement that treats Anthony Albanese with contempt, exposes him as weak, and his new friendship with China as a fraud. A Chinese warship, as I told you last week, used its sonar to deliberately hurt Australian Navy divers who were cutting away fishing nets that were wrapped around the propeller of the HMS Toowoomba. But Albanese, of course, still refuses to say or admit that he didn't even raise this attack with the Chinese President, Xi Jinping, when they met face-to-face a couple of days later at the APEC meeting in San Francisco. Although their body language suggested Albanese was instead all over the dictator like a fanboy, and so did his comments after their meeting. All was sweet.
I mean, it's obviously important that you keep the goodwill going and you stop with them in China.
Yes, and indeed after the summit finished as well, I had a much longer conversation with the President. It was positive.
Now, it was only after Albanese had left Xi and APEC that his government admitted to China's attack, the 4 days after it occurred. And Albanese simply called it dangerous and unprofessional. But that was still bad enough for China, told him to stay in his lane and stay away from China.
I hope the relevant parties will stop causing trouble at China's doorstep and work with China to jointly maintain the momentum of improvement and development of China-Australia relations.
Same up yours from China's Defence Ministry. No apology, no explanation, just shut up. We urge the Australian side to respect the facts and stop making reckless and irresponsible accusations against China. So you've got to ask how much aggression from China is Albanese going to take before he calls them out as a threat and not a wonderful trade partner.
It's propaganda, and we shouldn't abide it for a second. It's exactly what happens in relation to Japan, in relation to the Philippines, and in relation to other countries in the region. The fact is that there is aggressive behaviour taking place, and our country should be calling it out.
Joining me is the Tuesday panel, Louise Elliott, business consultant and Hobart City Councillor, and Will Kingston, host of Australiana, a weekly podcast from the Spectator Australia on politics and culture. Will, the government is priding itself on putting a lid on these things so it can, boast of better relations than China than under that silly Morrison government, more trade. Seems to me a very dangerous call.
It is a dangerous call, Andrew. There are some things that are more important than how many kilograms of beef and lobster that we can sell to Asian customers. And one of those is standing up for Australian values. We, as in the Australian media and political establishment, I think have our heads in the sand on China because the consequences are very scary. But consider this, it is more likely than not that China will try and retake Taiwan before the end of the decade. It is more likely than not that the US will intervene militarily on the side of Taiwan, and it is more likely than not, as a result of those two things, that Australia will need to make a choice. And I really hope that we are on the right side of that choice in standing up for our values. I fear we may not be when you see this sort of kowtowing from the Albanese government. But assuming that that stuff does happen, we need to make sure that we're economically independent of China, at least as much as possible, and that we're militarily ready for those consequences. I fear at the moment that we're not getting the right messaging from the Albanese government in that regard.
Louise Elliott, I mean, it seems to me that the years of China bullying Australia has in fact worked, because this government now doesn't want to say boo to that very militant goose. It won't speak up. Now, it's interesting that the ranking member of the US Senate Foreign Relations Committee has just called out this Chinese attack in much stronger terms than our own Prime Minister did. Jim Risch said China's latest provocation on the high sea, this time directed at Australia, is more than risky operational behaviour. It is an act of aggression undertaken in international waters, and it's true, isn't it?
Yes, it's completely true, and that's really troubling. It doesn't bode well when we have international players commenting on our, national security type things. And it also doesn't bode well from the perspective of we need a Prime Minister who starts as they mean to go on. And we can have a great relationship with China if it means that we're just a walkover. But we all know how dangerous that would be for our country. And that's not something that we want. We need a Prime Minister who's going to stand up for Australians, especially when our people are being hurt. I mean, that's the ultimate no-go. You don't do that. There's definitely a line drawn then. And we need Mr Albanese to stand up for Australians and stand up for our safety.
Well, it reminds me of about the very last words that the late Labor Senator Kimberley Kitching said just after lunch at my house. I said to her, is the Albanese government going to be as tough on China as it says, as the previous governments were? She looked at me like I was an idiot and said, hell no. Speaking of someone else who's close to Bill Shorten, his former Chief of Staff, Cameron Milner, he nailed this problem with this collapsing Albanese government in his column in the Australian today, Will. The whole piece is great, but let me just read out some of it. He said, Albanese has been distracted and simply not in the country enough for a leader supposedly dealing with the cost of living crisis. If not for the parliamentary sitting dates, Albo would no doubt find somewhere, anywhere else but Australia to fly in his plush Airbus that he reportedly calls Toto 1, named after his COVID-era pet dog. And Cameron Milner asked, when was the last time you saw the PM take a street walk and meet real Australians doing it tough? Now, Will, Milner has been close to Bill Shorten, and some might say, well, then it's sour grapes, here comes the successor. Or is that spot on?
It's pretty close, Andrew. The problem for Albanese is he doesn't know the man that he wants to be, or indeed the leader that he wants to be. He doesn't know whether he is that old leftist warrior from his youth, doesn't know whether he's going to fully embrace wokeism like the Democrats and the Labor Party in the UK. He doesn't know whether he should just be an old school Labor leader and focus on cost of living and helping the working class. He seems to not really know the type of Labor leader that he should be. And that's when you do start to just fall into the trappings of leadership, like the celebrity handshakes and the travel, because they're the things that you associate with being a prime minister. But they're not the important things. The important things are actually how you go about leaving a legacy and helping people. And I don't think Albanese really knows how he can or should do that.
I think he's a small town boy suddenly thinking, oh my God, how good is this? It's gone to his head. Now, Louise, as you know, with the free speech challenges to you, I'm all for free speech. But I tell you what, it's being tested by the vile things I'm hearing from pro-Palestinian protesters who, unlike the pro-Israel ones, so abusive, so threatening. New South Wales government is now tightening up its laws against hate speech. The Attorney General said it's specifically because of the tensions on our streets. I tell you, Louise, there's a cultural issue on that side of the debate that is really making me scared. I mean, it seems very different from the culture on the pro-Israel side.
Yes, well, we all know that there's a place and there's a need for these incitement of hatred, incitement of violence laws. But what happens is we need to make sure that they're not abused. And what we're seeing in Australia around the calls for genocide and things like that, that's absolutely the threshold that demands instant action. But we need to make sure, like I said, that laws like that are in place. The threshold set appropriately high. And we need to stamp out the behaviour that we're seeing. It's really, it's un-Australian and it's really dangerous and sad. So, I mean, all credit for taking action and making sure that people can come down swiftly on that behaviour, that terrible behaviour, but also hoping that the legislators and those implementing the legislation will always remember to make sure that threshold around curtailing free speech is appropriately high.
Yeah, Louise, I would say they might not need recourse to laws if people in positions of authority, cultural authority, spoke up instead of, like we're seeing with the Albanese government and so many other people as well. Louise Elliott, Will Kingston, thank you both so much for your time. After the break, if your child wants to go on a school strike against Israel on Thursday, there is an image I think you should show them so they know what really is at stake here. I'll show you that after this. Plus, amazing footage of how supporters of Hamas have now hijacked a ship and taken 25 more hostages. Warning, I'm about to show something very important, but also very distressing. I want to show you an image tonight that cuts through this false moral equivalence that so many pro-Palestinian activists are making between Israel and the Hamas terrorists it is fighting. And I've got to show it because I think evil triumphs when we hide its face, particularly from children who might be contemplating going on this anti-Israel protest on Thursday. Now, this is an image of a Jewish woman kneeling and begging for her life as a Hamas terrorist stands in front of her. Now, it's from footage of a Hamas terrorist attack on October 7, terrorists storming a kibbutz in Israel. One gunman chased some Jewish women. He killed one on the way, and when he caught this woman, she turned, she couldn't run anymore, dropped to her knees and begged for her life. I think she prayed from that posture. And the government let her beg for 5 seconds, 10 seconds, and I won't show what happened next because he just shot her dead. This is the evil, the reality of what protesters mean when they say, oh, Hamas, that's justified resistance. That. But to something I can show. One country, and only one, is so far openly fighting Israel on the Hamas side. It's Yemen, seized by Islamist Houthi rebels, backed by Iran, who sent a helicopter to capture this cargo ship in the Red Sea. It's a ship registered in London. It's operated by a Japanese company, and its crew of 25 is from the Philippines, Bulgaria, Ukraine, Romania, and Mexico, who these are all hostages now. But, of course, the crucial fact, the ship was owned by a Jew. And the hijackers shouted, God is the greatest. Well, what would such people do to you, do you think, if they caught you? Joining me from Israel is Ayelet Shaked, activist, software engineer, and now Israeli politician, a former Minister of the Interior and Minister of Justice. Thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate that. There has been so much talk lately of a ceasefire deal. 5 days of no shooting, Hamas releasing 50 of the 239 hostages it took, Israel in turn releasing, some say, 300 Palestinian prisoners, including terrorists. Is that a good deal, 50 innocents for 300 Palestinian prisoners?
First of all, Andrew, I want to thank you for showing the people in Australia the truth about the Hamas. You know, you showed a very sad photo, but, you know, in reality, it was much worse. They slaughtered our babies, they murdered our women, they raped women and then murdered them, they decapitated children. And I think that the Western world should understand. I'm sure that most of the people don't know the facts. Now, regarding your question, let's wait and see to know what are the details of the deal. But, Israel, we are trying to do anything we can in order to release the hostages. There are little babies there, like 9 months and 2 years old. There are babies, little children that they are alone there. They murder their parents, and the kids are alone there. And they are young women, and we are trying to do anything we can in order to bring them back. It is just a ceasefire. We are not going to stop until we will eliminate those monsters. It's a pure evil, and we are not going to stop until they will all be gone.
Hey, it says something about the respective value put on human life, that the Palestinians are demanding 300 of theirs for 50 of yours. That tells me something again. A lot of people are also telling me, look at the anti-Israel protests in the West. Israel is losing so many friends from this war. Is that how you see it? You know, this war is a disaster, Israel losing friends and allies. Or is Israel simply seeing that it never had that many friends really?
I think we have a lot of friends, but we are just see a massive anti-Semitism around the world. I have family also in Sydney and friends in Melbourne. I know that there is Jews hate also in Australia, but it's just the old anti-Semitism. You know, today it's not very in to be anti-Semitic, so you're against Israel. But it's just a new form of the old anti-Semitism. It was always there. And I hope that, you know, the good people and people like yourself and like others, that they understand that we are fighting not only our fight. It's not just the Israeli fight or the Jews. It's a fight for freedom, for liberty, for, you know, respecting human lives. And today it's Israel, tomorrow it can be the UK or the US. It's a radical Islam that I think the old Western world, we should unify and fight it together.
Let's check it. I look forward to the days when you're back in government. People are saying big things, expecting big things from you. Thank you so much for your time. After the break, the crazy, foul-mouthed new president of Argentina. Or on the other hand, can someone so against socialists be all that bad?
¡Zurdos, hijos de puta, tiemblen! ¡La libertad avanza! ¡Viva la libertad, carajo!
Argentina last weekend got a new president who sounds completely crazy, even by South American standards.
¿Sabés qué es esto, hijo de... ¡Pará! ¿Sabés qué es? La bandera anarcocapitalista. ¿Sí? La bandera de los liberales libertarios. El amarillo tiene que ver con la capacidad de generar riqueza, es decir, el oro.
Now, to be honest, until I saw that, I paid no attention to the election in Argentina. I mean, all of South America seems so hopeless, so badly managed for decades now, often by populists, leftists, the odd dictator, who've just squandered its promise, and Argentina's no different. Inflation now, 150%. Well, look at the value of its currency. 10 years ago, an Australian dollar was worth 5 pesos. Now it buys 233 pesos. So you might believe that after that, yes, Argentinians might be desperate enough to vote for just about anyone, including this economist who's unaligned, who does at least have a very photogenic partner and is a supporter of Israel, even though much of the media damns him as of the far right. He says no as a libertarian anarcho-capitalist, as you just saw. But this president is very clear. What Argentina cannot afford any more of is a leader of the left. And he's been campaigning to put a chainsaw through the bureaucracy and the spending. Well, joining me is Michael Reid, writer, journalist, speaker, visiting professor at the London School of Economics, whose books in South America include Forgotten Continent and Brazil. Michael Reid, thank you for joining me, but who is this new president that made my eyes wide open like never before?
Well, thank you for having me. I mean, he is an outsider. I mean, 3 years ago, nobody in Argentina had heard of him. He has won the presidency with that campaign, some of which you showed, of being a channel for the immense anger and frustration that Argentines feel because for the last 10 years, there's been no economic growth. Inflation, as you mentioned, is what it's heading for 200% this year. The central bank has no reserves. The government deficit is very large. It's financed by just printing pesos, and thus the value of the peso goes down. And many people were very fed up with the ruling Peronists who have been there for most of the past 20 years and have a powerful machine, but they really have no policies to get the country going again. Now, the big question is, can Milei actually deliver serious economic reform? He got a very large popular mandate in the vote, but his party is very small. He doesn't have a majority in the Congress. And you showed that, there are questions about how stable a personality he has and how effective he will be at doing the negotiations he will have to do if he is to govern.
I'm just wondering if he's doing it to get the attention. Being unaligned like that, you don't have the party machine behind you, so you've got to do something to get people to look at you. Being a maniac, I guess, helps. Or is he maybe, look, I'm trying to look at the bright side here, an eccentric who actually does know, once he's in office, what's good for his country? Have you got any idea about that?
Well, I think he's clearly a very effective communicator. And, communicators in this world today tend to do quite well. But, I would repeat, it's one thing to get to the presidency, it's another thing to govern quite a large country, right? And a complicated country. And he's not stupid. I mean, he's an economist. He hasn't been a kind of particularly prominent economist. He worked in the private sector for quite a long time. What we don't know, and there are lots of things we don't know about him, we don't know how good he will be at building a team, at delegating and letting bright people get on with the job,
Yeah, well, from the capering, I'm not sure he is a delegator, to be honest. Look, Michael, I'm just grabbing at straws here, okay, for Argentina's sake, if nothing else. When he talks instead of shouts, and when he shouts, the language is atrocious. I'm hearing something that's actually a little bit more like Margaret Thatcher than Coco the Clown. Here, for example, is one thing.
El socialismo es siempre y en todo lugar un fenómeno violento, asesino y empobrecedor. Esa es la característica del socialismo.
Look, Marguerite, we can all criticise him for all that, but I tell you what, there are not many distinguished leaders in Argentinian history to say, well, look, that was the model. Has socialism, in fact, like he implies, ruined Argentina?
Well, I think there's no doubt that the Argentine state is too big and too inefficient, right? And that the private sector is weighed down with a lot of controls and regulations and so on. I mean, I think there's an important point in what you're hinting at, right? In that, some of his proposals are, frankly, not operable. No? I mean, dollarizing a country, adopting the dollar as the currency in a country where one of the chronic problems has been lack of dollars. It's just not going to happen, right? Abolishing the central bank is not a good idea. You need a proper central bank that does the job properly, right? But what he has shown over the last month, since the first round of the presidential election, is that to the extent that he needed allies, he's shown that he will be flexible on policy questions. And there is a core of truth or the right thing to do in what he's saying. I mean, Argentina does need a smaller and more effective state. It needs to cut public spending. It needs to get the economy growing. It needs the central bank to behave as a proper central bank. So let's see.
Let's fingers crossed. Michael Reid, thank you for bringing sense to what seemed a bit like a circus. I appreciate that. Thank you for your time. That's it from me. Coming up next, Chris Kenny Tonight. Good night.